The seat that changed everything. Daniel always preferred aisle seats, especially in first class. He liked the extra room and the feeling of control it gave him, as if he could escape more easily if something went wrong. But today felt different, not because of the flight or the weather or even the early morning fog that wrapped around the runway like a secret, but because of a strange sense that had been following him since he woke up, a feeling like something was about to shift. He had felt it first when he opened his eyes to the blinking red light on his bedside clock, flashing for 44 a.m. That number stuck with him. It wasn't the time that bothered him, but the symmetry, the eerie perfection of it. Like a code from the universe trying to tell him something. He had pushed the thought away, chalking it up to lack of sleep and the tension of returning to Atlanta for the first time in years. But the feeling didn't leave. It stayed with him as he packed his bag, as he stepped into the cab, as he checked in and walked through security. It even lingered when he ordered black coffee from the small cafe near Gate BET, where the barista didn't make eye contact and where the radio kept skipping as if something didn't want the song to play. Now seated on the plane, Daniel closed his eyes briefly and took a breath. The scent of leather seats and stale air filled his lungs. First class was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt expensive, the kind that seemed designed to keep everyone inside their own bubble. Across the aisle, a businessman in a navy suit was already asleep, mouth open slightly. Behind him, a woman tapped her nails on her phone screen, typing furiously. Daniel looked down at his hands and noticed they were slightly shaking, a tremor he hadn't felt in years. He clenched them into fists and forced himself to focus. The boarding process dragged on. He could hear the grumbles of passengers in economy, the shuffle of feet, the dragging of overstuffed luggage, the constant beeping of the scanner as each ticket was processed. And then, like a whisper in a crowded room, she appeared. The elderly woman stepped onto the plane slowly, carefully, her back slightly bent, her eyes scanning the cabin as if she didn't quite know where she was or why she was there. Her grey hair was tied into a loose bun, and she wore a faded blue coat that looked at least 20 years old. Her left hand held a leather purse, and her right held the boarding pass, with a slight tremble, not from fear but age. The flight attendant smiled, offered to help, but the woman shook her head politely and continued walking. As she passed through the curtain separating first class from the rest of the plane, Daniel felt an impulse he couldn't explain. He stood up without a second thought, interrupting the quiet cocoon of privilege around him. The people nearby looked at him with mild annoyance. The flight attendant stepped toward him, confused. He turned to the woman and said, "Please take my seat." She looked startled, as if she hadn't heard him correctly. He repeated, "You can have my seat, it's my first class. I don't mind sitting in the back." The woman hesitated, eyes widening. "I couldn't possibly," she said. But he insisted, "Please, it would make me happy." She stared at him a moment longer, and then, without another word, nodded gently. Daniel stepped aside, allowed her to take his seat, and grabbed his bag. As he walked down the narrow aisle, passengers watched him curiously. A young man giving up a first-class seat wasn't something they saw every day. He squeezed into a middle seat near the rear of the plane, beside a large man who barely fit in his own chair, and a teenage girl chewing gum and scrolling through TikTok. The space was cramped, and the air was warmer back here, almost humid. But Daniel didn't care. Somehow, the decision had given him a sense of calm. As the plane began taxiing down the runway, the engines roaring louder, he leaned his head back and tried to relax. Once airborne, the flight settled into its usual rhythm. The fastened seatbelt sign turned off with a chime. People began opening their laptops, plugging in headphones, asking for water or snacks. Daniel stared at the back of the seat in front of him, feeling a dull ache form in his neck. He had just closed his eyes when a hand tapped his shoulder. It was the flight attendant from earlier. She smiled and held out a small folded piece of paper. "She asked me to give you this," she said. Daniel took the note, confused, and watched as the attendant walked away. He unfolded the paper slowly, expecting a thank you message. But what he read made his blood run cold. "I know what you did in 1997. We need to talk before we land." For a moment, Daniel couldn't move. He stared at the words, reading them over and over again, as if the meaning might change. But it didn't. The message was clear. Someone knew. Someone had dug into the part of his life he had buried so deep, even he barely thought about it. His pulse quickened. Sweat formed on the back of his neck. He looked toward the front of the plane, trying to see the elderly woman, but from where he was seated, the first-class cabin was out of view. He folded the note again, this time more carefully, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He needed to stay calm. He needed to think. But the moment he closed his eyes, the memories came flooding back, memories he had worked years to forget. The summer of 1997, he had just turned 16. His family had moved to a small town in Georgia, a place so quiet it felt like the world had forgotten it. His father was a preacher, strict and unforgiving. His mother was quiet, always in the kitchen, always pretending nothing was wrong. Daniel had spent most of that summer wandering the woods behind their house, trying to escape the suffocating air of their home. That's where he met her, Melissa. She was 17, wild, free, with eyes that saw through everything. She had moved there with her aunt after her parents died in a car crash. The town whispered about her. They called her cursed, unlucky, strange, but Daniel didn't care. She made him feel alive. They spent every day together, exploring abandoned barns, swimming in the lake, sharing secrets under the stars. But then something happened, something terrible, something that changed everything. And just like that, she was gone. The town said she ran away. Her aunt filed a report. The sheriff didn't look too hard. They said Melissa was troubled, that she had probably taken off with someone. But Daniel knew the truth, or at least part of it. He had never told anyone what really happened that night by the lake. And now, decades later, someone had found him, someone who knew. He tried to steady his breathing, but questions flooded his mind. Who was M? Was it Melissa? No, it couldn't be. She was gone. She had to be. Then who? Her aunt, a friend, someone who had been watching all these years. He looked around the plane, at the passengers chatting, laughing, sleeping. Any one of them could be connected. But the note had come from the elderly woman. Why now? Why today? The flight still had 3 hours to go. Daniel felt trapped, like the walls of the cabin were closing in on him. He considered getting up, walking to the front, confronting her, but something told him to wait. He needed answers. But more than that, he needed to remember exactly what had happened that night. Because maybe, just maybe, he had forgotten something important. And whatever it was coming back for him. A name he buried long ago. Daniel sat frozen in his seat as the low hum of the aircraft seemed to grow louder. Around him, although no one else seemed to notice anything different, people continued to scroll through their phones, sip their drinks, and chat in hushed tones with seatmates as the flight moved steadily forward through the clouds. But inside his mind, Daniel was no longer on board. He was drifting back into a past he had tried so hard to bury. Each second he stared out the window brought clearer pictures into focus: the smell of pine trees, the murky lake water, the weight of that summer pressing down on his chest like a secret he could never fully forget. He clenched the armrest as the name Melissa echoed in his head. He hadn't spoken that name in decades, hadn't dared to think of her face for more than a moment without feeling like he was going to fall into a void. Now this woman, who sat just rows ahead of him, had not only spoken of 1997, but signed the note with a single initial M, the same letter that had haunted him like a ghost hiding in the corners of his life. He tried to focus, to think logically. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe it wasn't her. Maybe someone else with the same initial, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. The exact year, the specific tone of the note, it was too precise, too personal, and too perfectly timed. The memory of that night came back in fragments like pieces of broken glass, reflecting flashes of moonlight. Melissa had called him to meet her at the lake. She had sounded different on the phone, not angry but urgent, like she had discovered something, like she needed to tell him something important. He remembered sneaking out past midnight, his father asleep in the study, his mother not noticing. As always, he had taken the path through the woods, the one they always used, and when he reached the lake, Melissa had already been there, standing by the water in her bare feet, holding something in her hands. He could never forget the look in her eyes that night. It wasn't fear, it was something else, something like disappointment or maybe heartbreak. They argued. He remembered that her voice rising, her eyes filling with tears. She said he had lied to her about something, said she had found out the truth, but before he could understand what she meant, she had turned away and walked straight into the dark water. He had chased her, screaming her name, splashing after her, but the lake was thick and black and she had disappeared. Before he could reach her, he dove under, searching frantically, his lungs burning, but found nothing. The water swallowed her whole, and then there was only silence. He never told anyone, not the sheriff, not his parents, not even himself. He convinced himself she had run away. Like everyone said, because the truth was unbearable, because he couldn't be the reason. Someone vanished because he couldn't be the last person who saw her alive, but now someone knew. Someone had brought that night back to life, and he couldn't ignore it anymore. Daniel felt his heartbeat quicken and his vision blur. He wiped his palms on his jeans and forced himself to breathe slowly. He had to face this. He had to understand who the woman was and what she wanted. He stood up, slowly ignoring the glances from the man beside him, who shifted irritably in his seat. Daniel walked carefully down the aisle, his eyes scanning each row ahead, until he reached the curtain that separated first class from coach. He gently pulled it back and peered inside. The woman was sitting with her hands folded neatly on her lap, her eyes closed, her face peaceful, as if she was sleeping. Daniel hesitated for a moment and then stepped forward. The flight attendant noticed and moved toward him. "I'm sorry, sir. First class is restricted." Daniel held up the note silently and whispered, "She sent this to me. I just need to speak to her for a moment." The attendant looked uncertain, but after a glance at the elderly woman, she nodded and stepped aside. Daniel knelt beside the seat and spoke quietly. "Ma'am." The woman opened her eyes slowly and looked at him with a softness that was disarming. Her eyes were deep gray like storm clouds and full of something he couldn't name: recognition, sadness, maybe even forgiveness. "Hello, Daniel," she said in a voice that cracked slightly, as if she hadn't used it in years. "It's been a long time." He stared at her, unable to speak. His mind raced. "Who are you? How do you know me? Why now?" She smiled gently. "I know you have questions, and I promise I'll answer them, but not here, not while everyone is watching. Meet me at gate C12. After we land, I'll explain everything." Before he could respond, the attendant returned and gently tapped his shoulder. "Sir, you need to return to your seat now, please." He nodded numbly, stood and walked back to his seat. The rest of the flight passed in a haze. He didn't eat, didn't sleep, didn't even blink much. He just kept going over her words over and over in his head. Gate C12. After landing, what could she possibly have to say? What truth had survived all these years? He thought of Melissa's face that night, of the water, of the silence that followed, and wondered if what he believed had happened was even the truth anymore. When the plane landed, Daniel moved quickly through the terminal, his eyes scanning every sign until he saw it. Gate C12. It was at the far end of the airport, quiet and empty compared to the rest. He arrived 5 minutes early and waited, trying to ignore the sweat dripping down his back. The clock ticked loudly in his mind, each second stretching out like an eternity. And then she arrived, walking slowly, her coat buttoned tightly, her purse held close to her side. She nodded at him and motioned toward a nearby bench. They sat in silence for a moment before she spoke. "I'm not who you think I am, but I am connected to what happened that night." Daniel turned to face her, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Then tell me, who are you and how do you know about Melissa?" The woman took a breath. "My name is Margaret. I was Melissa's aunt, the one who raised her after her parents died. I filed a missing person report. I answered the sheriff's questions, and I spent the next 2 years wondering why no one was telling the truth." Daniel's head spun. Margaret's eyes never left his. "I found something after she disappeared, a journal. Letters written to you, photographs of the two of you together, things I didn't even know existed at first. I thought you might have run away together, but then I began to look deeper. I asked questions people avoided. I visited the lake. I followed every clue, but it all led to silence. No one wanted to believe that something more sinister might have happened. They said Melissa was troubled. They said she had run away, but I never believed it, and I never stopped looking." Daniel felt his throat tighten. "I never meant for any of it to happen," he whispered. "I tried to save her. I really did." Margaret placed a hand on his. "She wasn't trying to die, Daniel. She was trying to scare you. She wanted you to see the truth about something she had discovered, something she had written about in her journal." Daniel felt like the floor had tilted beneath him. What truth? Margaret opened her purse and pulled out a faded notebook. She handed it to him. The cover was cracked, the pages yellowed, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Melissa's. He flipped through slowly, his eyes scanning words, names, dates, and then something stopped him. A page titled "The Pastor's Secrets." Under it, Melissa had written in shaky hand, "He's not who he says he is." Daniel looked up in shock. "What is this?" Margaret looked away. "Your father, Daniel, the man the town worshipped, the man who controlled everything. Melissa discovered things about him, things that explained why so many people lived in fear. She told me once that she Thought your father was dangerous, that he had hurt people, that he was hiding something big. Daniel felt like the world had collapsed beneath him. His father had been strict, yes, unforgiving, even cruel at times, but dangerous. He thought of the bruises. His mother never explained the locked study, the midnight visits from strangers that were never spoken of, and suddenly it all made a horrible kind of sense. She was going to tell the world, Margaret said, and then she vanished. Daniel's hands shook. As he closed the journal, I didn't know, I swear to you. I didn't know she had found out all this. I thought it was about me. I thought I had done something. Margaret nodded. I believe you, but now it's time for the truth to come out. Daniel took a deep breath and looked at the journal again. He realized that the story wasn't just about Melissa anymore. It was about everything that had been buried, everything that had festered in silence for decades. It was about justice and maybe redemption. Too, he stood slowly and helped Margaret to her feet. We need to go to the authorities, he said. We need to tell them everything. Margaret smiled, and for the first time Daniel saw peace in her eyes. Yes, she said, it's time. But as they turned to walk away, Daniel's phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket and saw a message from an unknown number. It read, "They know you're talking. Meet me at the lake tonight, or she won't be the last." Daniel froze and slowly turned to Margaret, who had seen the screen. Her face paled. She looked up at him and whispered, "It's starting again, isn't it?" The message from the shadows. Daniel stared at the message on his phone, as if the screen itself had turned to ice in his hand. The words were simple, but the weight behind them felt suffocating. "They know you're talking. Meet me at the lake tonight, or she won't be the last." His fingers clenched around the device, as if crushing it could erase what he had just seen. Margaret stood beside him, silent, but not still. Her hands were trembling slightly, her breathing shallow, like someone reliving a nightmare that had waited years in silence, just to return. He turned to her and asked quietly, "Do you know who could have sent this?" She didn't answer. Right away, her eyes locked on the screen, as if trying to decipher not just the message, but the intention behind it. Finally, she said, "I think this is about more than Melissa. This is about what she found, what she was about to expose, what she was taken for." Daniel's thoughts raced. He had believed for so long that Melissa's death had been a tragic accident, the result of fear, misunderstanding and youth, but now the possibility that her disappearance had been orchestrated, that someone had been watching even back then, twisted his insides into a knot. He remembered her last words to him. How angry she had been, how scared. He hadn't understood her then, but maybe she had been trying to warn him. Maybe she had discovered something far darker than he had ever imagined, and now, decades later, someone still didn't want that secret to come out here. And Margaret sat down on a bench near the far window of the terminal, where few people passed the world outside. The glass looked normal. Planes landing, passengers walking across the tarmac, ground staff waving signals, but inside, Daniel felt like he was falling deeper into something that had no floor. "We need to go to the police," he said firmly. "We need to tell them everything. You have Melissa's journal, and now this message. We can't let them scare us into silence again." Margaret looked at him, her eyes steady but tired, and replied, "We can go to the police, but if the people involved are the same ones who were in power, then they may still have influence now. They may have buried the truth once. They might do it again. What if going to the police puts us in more danger?" Daniel hated how right she might be, but he also knew that doing nothing wasn't an option. The message had made one thing clear: whoever was behind this still believed he was connected, still believed he knew more than he actually did, and they were willing to threaten others to keep the truth hidden. "What if it's not just a threat?" he asked. "What if someone else is already in danger?" Margaret took a deep breath, then said, "We go to the lake tonight." Just like they asked, but we go prepared. We don't go alone. Daniel nodded, unsure of what prepared even meant, against someone willing to hide a murder for more than 20 years. He didn't know what kind of people they were dealing with, but one thing was certain: they weren't bluffing. He felt it in the message, in the fear returning to Margaret's eyes, in the weight of the journal still tucked inside his jacket. They left the airport in silence, taking a taxi through the city. The streets were familiar, but felt distant, like a place from someone else's memory. Atlanta had changed in the years since Daniel had left, but certain landmarks still stood like statues of a former life. The church, where his father once preached, the courthouse, where his sermons had often turned into public declarations of judgment, the same courthouse where Daniel had once stood outside watching townspeople whisper Melissa's name without ever offering to search for her, the same place where the town had quietly erased her existence from memory, calling it another lost soul who couldn't survive the weight of the world. He felt anger, rise inside him, not just at whoever had sent the message, but at himself, for believing what he had been told, for letting go of the truth, so easily, for surviving when maybe he shouldn't have. They reached Margaret's small apartment tucked into a quiet neighborhood of brick buildings and tall oaks. She opened a drawer and pulled out a folder filled with papers, photos, and newspaper clippings. It was everything she had collected over the years, every lead, every rumor, every theory. There were photos of the lake from different seasons, maps marked with red circles, a list of people who had visited the church in the months before. Melissa vanished. Daniel scanned the names and felt a chill when he saw one he recognized, not just from memory, but from that very flight hours earlier. The man in the navy suit who had sat across the aisle in first class, Reverend Charles Harlow, the former youth minister at his father's church. Daniel remembered him as a charismatic man, always smiling, always preaching about discipline and purity. But now his name appeared 3 times in Melissa's journal, each time marked with a question mark, and once with the words, "He followed me today." Daniel felt bile rise in his throat. He remembered how Harlow used to give long sermons about fire and sin, and how Melissa had told him once that she didn't trust him, that he watched her too closely. Daniel never questioned it then, never even mentioned it, but now it felt like a puzzle piece finally snapping into place. What if Harlow was part of it? What if he was the one who had followed her to the lake? Or worse, what if he had met her there? "We have to find him," Daniel said, his voice barely hiding the rage. Margaret nodded. "I've kept track of him. He moved to a smaller church outside the city, near where the old lake road ends, the one no one uses anymore." Daniel clenched his fists. "Then that's where we start tonight." They packed the journal, a flashlight, a recorder, and Margaret's folder and waited until dusk. The drive was long and quiet, the sky slowly turning from gold to gray to black as they passed the city limits. The streetlights grew sparse and the roads narrower. Daniel remembered the path well, every curve, every tree, every abandoned sign. As they neared the lake, he felt time folding in on itself, like he was 16 again. Lost, scared, desperate, and now returning. Not just to a place, but to a truth he had buried for half his life. They parked just off the road behind a line of trees. The lake shimmered under the moonlight, still and dark the way it had always been, a natural mirror reflecting secrets. Daniel held the flashlight low and led the way. The woods smelled the same, like damp earth and old moss. Every step echoed in his memory until they reached the clearing where he had last seen her. "This is where she stood," he whispered. Margaret nodded and placed the recorder on a flat rock. She spoke clearly. "If anyone is listening, we have come to finish what Melissa started. We have her words, her truth. We are not afraid." The silence that followed felt endless. Then a sound rustled in the trees behind them. Daniel turned his light and caught the glint of something metal. A figure stepped forward, slow, deliberate. A man in a dark coat, face partially hidden by the shadows. He stopped several feet away and spoke. "You shouldn't have come back." Daniel stepped in front of Margaret. "Who are you? What do you want?" The man laughed low and bitter. "You already know why. I'm here. You were told to come alone. You broke the rules." Daniel raised his voice. "Tell me what happened to her. Tell me the truth." The man stepped closer now, visible under the moonlight. It was Harlow, his face aged, but his eyes still cold, still empty. She was going to ruin everything he said. She didn't understand the balance. "We were maintaining the order. We had built your father, knew your father approved, and you were supposed to be one of us." Daniel felt his world fracture. His father knew. "What did you do to her?" Harlow's smile was thin. "I didn't touch her, but I watched her walk into that lake, and let her drown because silence is sometimes more powerful than words." Daniel lunged forward, but Margaret held him back. Harlow took a step backward and said, "You'll never prove anything. Her body is gone. Her words mean nothing unless someone listens, and no one will." Daniel looked down at the journal in his hand and whispered, "No, you're wrong. Someone already has a second." Light appeared behind Harlow. Another figure emerged, this time not from the trees but from the trail. A young woman in a black jacket, holding a badge and a gun. "Stay right there. Atlanta PD," she shouted. "We got everything recorded." Daniel turned to Margaret, who smiled through her tears. "I sent the journal days ago. I knew we'd need more than memories to break this open." Harlow tried to run, but it was too late. The woman tackled him to the ground and placed him in cuffs. His protests vanished into the night, like the lies he had hidden for years. The silence that followed was different now. Not heavy, not haunted, but free. Daniel walked back to the lake's edge and stared at the water, the same water that had once swallowed everything but now reflected the truth he never thought he'd find. He whispered her name once. Melissa and the wind moved through the trees like a sigh of relief. The silence beneath the water. Daniel stared at the handcuffs wrapped around Reverend Harlow's wrists. As the officer radioed for backup and read him his rights, the words seemed distant, like echoes bouncing inside a cave of memories that no longer obeyed time or sense. Margaret stood beside him, silent, yet victorious, her eyes glistening, not with joy but with something heavier, something closer to release, as if the weight of decades had finally begun to lift. And yet, despite the arrest, despite the confession, despite the presence of real, undeniable evidence, Daniel felt no closure, only a deeper churning in his chest, like the story had not ended here, but had only peeled back its first rotten layer. Harlow had spoken with the cold certainty of a man who believed he was untouchable, and that confidence had come from somewhere, from someone, and Daniel couldn't ignore the way he had mentioned his father, not just once, but with authority and familiarity. It was not a passing reference, it was a declaration, as if Harlow still saw him as part of their world, a member of something older, darker, and far more widespread than Daniel had imagined. The officer, a young woman with clear, steady eyes, turned to Daniel and Margaret and said, "We need to take you both in for a statement and protective custody for the night. Harlow won't be alone out here. If he's been part of something bigger, then it's not safe." Daniel nodded and glanced back at the lake. The moonlight danced on its surface, but now he could see how still it really was, as if the water had held its breath all these years, waiting for someone to speak, allowed the truth it had drowned to protect. They returned to the city, escorted by the patrol car, the silence inside, the vehicle thick with unspoken thoughts. Daniel stared out the window, but his reflection stared back, not as the man who had once fled his past, but as someone now entangled in it again, as someone now forced to choose between running and fighting. At the station they were given warm drinks, thin blankets, and a small room where two detectives took turns listening to every detail. Margaret and Daniel could remember the journal was scanned, catalogued, and entered into evidence. Harlow's words from the recording were transcribed and printed, and still Daniel felt it wasn't enough, because the thing gnawing at him wasn't just the horror of what had happened to Melissa, or the fear that others might still be involved. It was the burning, unanswered question that refused to leave his mind. Did his father know? Was he part of it? Had Daniel grown up in a house built on silence, cruelty, and sin, and never seen the truth for what it was? He turned to Margaret, after the officers had left, and asked her directly, "What did he mean when he said my father knew? What did Melissa write about him in the journal that you didn't tell me?" Margaret looked down at her hands folded in her lap, and then raised her eyes slowly. "Daniel, your father wasn't just the preacher, he was the voice behind it all, the one who encouraged secrecy, who believed fear was a tool of salvation. He recruited men like Harlow, gave them power in exchange for loyalty. Melissa suspected more than just words. She believed he covered up things in the church, money gone missing, people silenced, women harassed, even children manipulated. And when she told me she was planning to go to the police, I begged her to be careful because I knew what your father was capable of, but I never imagined she would disappear." Daniel felt the air thicken around him like smoke without fire, no flames, no alarm, just the invisible, choking presence of something that had been there all along, hiding in plain sight. He remembered the sermons, the stern look his father gave him when he asked too many questions, the long nights behind locked doors, and now all of it played back in his mind, like film unspooling in reverse, building toward a climax. He had missed because he hadn't known what to look for that night in the protective cell. He didn't sleep. He sat on the edge of the small cot, staring at the concrete wall, counting the shadows moving across it. As the hours passed by, just before dawn, an officer came in and told him there was someone requesting to see him, someone unexpected. Daniel followed him down a hallway past empty desks and tired guards until he reached a small visiting room, and on the other side of the glass sat a man with silver hair, a neatly trimmed beard, and eyes that seemed to calm for the moment. Daniel froze. It was his father, Pastor Elijah Turner. Still looked like a man who believed in control. Everything about him, from his perfectly ironed shirt to the way he folded his hands on the table, spoke of someone who measured each word, each breath, each movement. Daniel took a seat on the other side. The phone buzzed and he lifted it to his ear but didn't speak. Elijah's voice came through, steady and cold. "Son, I heard what happened. I came to see you before the media does." Daniel's voice cracked. "Why did you come? Really to warn me or to stop me?" Elijah didn't blink. I came to remind you that there are things in this world that you do not understand, that some truths destroy more than they save. Melissa didn't understand that, and look what happened to her. Daniel's hand clenched the receiver. Are you saying you let her die? Elijah sighed as if disappointed, not shocked, not angry, just weary. She had potential, but she became a threat. You may not remember it that way, but I do, and so do others. Daniel leaned closer and asked one question. Did you kill her? Elijah's eyes narrowed. I didn't need to. She walked into that lake thinking she could scare us, thinking you would follow her and bring her back. Instead you ran, and we let the story die. Daniel slammed the phone against the glass, but it didn't shatter. He stood up, breathing heavily. His father just stared at him, then picked up the phone again, calmly saying, if you pursue this the way I think you will, then you will not just destroy me, you'll bring down names you don't even know were involved. Men who still preach, men who now run charities, judges, senators' names, who sat in our pews and bowed their heads while planning the next sermon of silence. You want justice, fine, but be ready for what. Daniel was taken back to his room, his thoughts racing like wildfire. He had his answer, and yet it burned worse than doubt, because now it wasn't just his father. It was a network, a system, a chain of men and rules and threats that had operated in the shadows for years. He returned to Margaret and told her everything. She listened without speaking, and then said, it's time the world hears. Melissa's voice, for real. We take the journal, we take the audio, and we go public. Daniel nodded but said, first I need to see the lake one last time, not to look for her body, but for closure. Margaret hesitated, then agreed. That afternoon, they drove back again, but this time it felt different. This time he wasn't afraid. The trees greeted him like old witnesses to a crime, finally spoken aloud. The breeze carried, not whispers but release. They reached the clearing and stood at the water's edge. Daniel stepped forward and dropped a single white flower into the lake. Watching it float gently before sinking, it was not goodbye, it was permission. Permission to move forward, to speak, to shout, to stand against the weight that had silenced them all for too long. Suddenly, a rustle came from the trees. Daniel turned and saw another figure standing there. It was the policewoman from the night before, her face serious. She walked toward them and handed Daniel a folder. We just finished searching Harlow's home. She said you need to see this. Inside were dozens of letters, old photos, lists of names and dates, and on one page, a single photo that made Daniel's knees weaken. It was Melissa at the church, smiling with a child on her lap, and beside her stood Pastor Elijah Turner with his hand on her shoulder, and in the corner, barely visible, was Harlow and two other men, one of whom Daniel recognized from political ads, a senator still in office. Daniel looked up. This goes deeper than we thought. The officer nodded. We're assembling a task force, but if you go public now, you might be their next target. Daniel closed the folder slowly and said, I'm not hiding, not anymore. They wanted silence, but now they'll hear everything. The sermon that never ended. Daniel held the folder tightly against his chest as if its contents were the last remaining pieces of a puzzle he had been trying to solve since the day Melissa disappeared beside him. Margaret remained quiet, not because she lacked anything to say, but because the silence between them had become sacred, a space where everything spoken carried the weight of truth and memory. The sun was starting to descend behind the treetops, casting long shadows across the surface of the lake, and for the first time in many years, Daniel didn't feel like he was standing over a grave, but over a door that had remained locked for too long. The photo inside the folder with Melissa, the child, his father, Harlow, and the other men had changed everything. It was no longer just about what had happened in 1997. It was about a network built on obedience, deception, and control, and now they were going to pull it all down, piece by piece, starting with the one place where it had all begun, the church. They drove in silence until the church spire came into view, piercing the sky like a needle through skin. The structure was the same, the tall wooden doors, the stained glass windows, the familiar stone steps worn by years of footsteps and prayers. Daniel remembered walking up those steps every Sunday, suit too tight, collar too stiff, forced smiles and heavy sermons. His father's voice had always filled the space, not just with words but with authority. Daniel had never known the difference back then between guidance and control, but now, with every memory flashing in front of his eyes, he saw the design behind the ritual, the manipulation behind the scripture, the fear disguised as discipline. They stepped out of the car and approached the building. The street was mostly empty, but Daniel knew they were being watched. He could feel it, not in paranoia but in the way the shadows shifted too quickly. The way a parked car across the street seemed to hum with silence. They were close for comfort, and yet not close enough to the truth. The doors opened with a creak, and the scent of old wood and candle wax drifted out like a memory. Daniel stepped inside and was instantly overwhelmed by the wave of familiarity that hit him. The pews, lined up in perfect rows, the altar draped in deep red, the pulpit that once stood as the center of his father's world, and now felt like a relic of control. Margaret walked beside him, her steps hesitant but sure, as if her own memories had returned to walk beside her. Daniel moved toward the pulpit, his fingers brushing the edge of the wood where his father's hands once gripped tightly as he spoke of righteousness and obedience. He imagined the sermons now not as words of salvation, but as codes meant to bind and bury the truths they feared. Melissa had understood that maybe even before anyone else had, and for that she had paid the price. Behind the pulpit, a door led to the private quarters of the church offices, prayer rooms, and his father's old study. It had always been locked, always off limits, and now, with the master key taken from the evidence, Daniel opened it. The room smelled of paper, ink, and something faintly sour. Dust floated through the air like trapped ghosts. Daniel turned on the light, and the room flickered to life. A large desk, bookshelves, and an old filing cabinet stood like sentinels guarding the past. Margaret walked toward the bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines until she found a thin leather binder. She opened it and gasped. Daniel turned quickly and saw what she held inside were ledger pages, names and amounts, initials, dates and notes, all written in his father's distinct handwriting. Payments labeled donation, returned, favor, transport, arranged, and in between those cold words were the names of people who had once filled the pews, respected men, pillars of the community, teachers, judges, businessmen. Names Daniel recognized names from the photo, and names from the present one stood out more than the rest. Senator A.J. Cole, the man whose campaign ads ran every year with the slogan Faith, Family, Future. He was there in the photo, standing behind Harlow and Melissa, and he was here in this book listed as recurring donor and guest of honor. Daniel's stomach turned. This was no longer just about Melissa. It was about all the girls, all the names lost to silence, all the children who had walked through those doors and never spoken again. "We need to get this to the task force," Margaret said, but Daniel hesitated. "What if the police have leaks? What if someone inside is connected? Then we find someone we can trust." Margaret looked at him and said, "The woman officer who arrested Harlow, her name is Detective Alvarez. She believed us from the start. We go to her." Daniel nodded, and they turned to leave, but the door at the back creaked open before they reached it, and a man stepped inside, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in black, and with eyes that did not blink. "Senator Cole." He stepped forward and said calmly, "You should not be here." Daniel stepped in front of Margaret, holding the binder tight. "We know what you did," he said. "We have proof." Cole smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes, the kind that belonged to a man who had walked through decades of lies without ever getting caught. "You think this ends with a folder with an arrest," he said. "You have no idea how deep this goes. Your father was just one piece, Harlow another, but me, I'm the one who kept it balanced." Daniel's voice shook but stayed strong. "You abused your power. You hurt people." Cole tilted his head. "You think I did this for myself? You think we did this for pleasure? No, we did it for preservation, because chaos comes when people stop fearing consequence. The system needed order. Your father understood that, and so did every man in that photo except Melissa. She wanted chaos. She wanted light in a place that required shadows." Daniel stepped forward and said, "And you silenced her." Cole took another step. "You want the truth, boy. Your father gave you a choice that night. You could have saved her, but you didn't. You froze. And that's why you're here now, because you're still trying to fix what you broke." Daniel felt like the ground beneath him had turned to sand. He remembered that night, again, this time more vividly. Melissa shouting his name, his feet frozen, her eyes wide before she disappeared, the water swallowing her scream, and he had stood there helpless, not because he didn't care, but because he didn't understand. But now he did. He turned to Margaret. "We need to go now." Cole didn't move. Instead, he said, "I suggest you think very carefully before you try to go public. That folder can disappear. You can disappear. People already have." Daniel stared at him, then said, "I'm not afraid of you. Not anymore. We'll see," Cole said, as he turned and disappeared through the same door he came from. They ran from the church, binder clutched tightly, made their way to the car and drove straight to the precinct, asking for Detective Alvarez. She met them in a private room and listened as Daniel explained everything again, showing her the binder, the photo, the journal, the messages, and then the most recent confrontation. Her face grew pale as she flipped through the pages. She stood up and said, "I'll put this in evidence and bring in the internal affairs team. We need federal support." But Daniel said, "No, you need to get this on record now, because if anything happens to us, that folder becomes the center of everything." Alvarez nodded and arranged for a video deposition within the hour. Daniel spoke for almost 2 hours, laying out everything from the beginning: the flight, the note, the journal, the lake, the confrontation, and the folder. When it was done, he felt like he had given something away, not just facts, but a part of himself, something heavy that he had carried for too long. That night, Daniel and Margaret were moved to a safe location while the task force mobilized. But as they tried to sleep, a call came through from an unknown number. Margaret answered, and her face turned white. She handed the phone to Daniel, and a voice spoke low and deliberate. "You should not have spoken. You want truth. Fine, but truth has cost, and tonight it is paid. Check your inbox." The call ended. Daniel opened his phone and found a photo sent moments earlier. It was Detective Alvarez lying unconscious, her badge beside her, and blood on her temple. "Truth will not kneel." Daniel stared at the photo on his phone, as if time itself had stopped. The image of Detective Alvarez unconscious, blood staining the tile floor beside her badge, lying crooked near her hand like a fallen shield. It wasn't just a threat anymore. It was an act of war, a reminder that the men they were up against didn't whisper from the dark, they struck from it, and they had no intention of letting him or Margaret walk away with the truth still burning in their hands. Margaret stood beside him, her breath shallow but steady, her eyes locked on the phone as if memorizing every detail, not out of shock but out of preparation. They had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. Daniel felt something in him shift, not fear, not rage, but clarity, a sharp, still kind of knowing, like steel cooling after flame. He turned to Margaret and said, "We end this now. No more warnings, no more hiding. If they want the world to stay blind, then we'll force it." They gathered everything: the binder, the journal, the photos, the voice recordings, the video testimony, and uploaded them to multiple encrypted cloud drives, sharing access with 3 trusted contacts across the country, including a retired investigative journalist, a former judge turned whistleblower, and a trauma therapist who ran a non-profit for survivors. They wrote a statement together, not for the police, not for the courts, but for the public. It began with Melissa's name and ended with a vow. "We were silent once, but never again." They sent it to over 100 news outlets, local, national, independent, international, the ones that had nothing to lose and everything to expose. And when the message was sent, Daniel looked at the clock and said, "Now, we wait." But they didn't have to wait long. The world moved fast when given something real, something dangerous, something undeniable. Within an hour, the story broke on 3 platforms. Within 2 hours, it was trending. Within 6, it was everywhere. The photo, the journal, excerpts, the audio of Reverend Harlow's confession, the ledger with Senator Cole's name, the confrontation at the church, the old photo showing Melissa with the men who claimed holiness and power. All of it splashed across screens like blood on glass. 1,000 headlines screamed the same question: how deep does it go? And in living rooms, offices, subway trains, and cafes, people stared at the screen and whispered her name, Melissa, the one they forgot, the one who never stopped trying to speak, even after they silenced her. But while the world read and raged and wept, the darkness responded with fire before sunrise. The safe house was compromised. A car pulled into the alley, headlights off a silent signal, and then a blast shattered the sidewall. Daniel and Margaret hit the floor, the windows bursting inward, a flash of heat and smoke and chaos. But by some miracle they survived, scraped, bruised, disoriented, but alive. And when the sirens came, it was not the police, it was the task force led by federal officers who had just received the documents from one of Daniel's emergency contacts. They were pulled from the rubble, treated, and taken to a secure federal building where for the next 18 hours they gave every detail again and again. Every name, every event, every file. Meanwhile, across the country, warrants were issued, offices raided, accounts frozen. A second pastor in Ohio, a youth director in Alabama, a private counselor in Tennessee, all arrested in coordinated sweeps, connected by ledger numbers, by letters, by recordings, and behind them all the same thin red line, leading back to the pulpit of Elijah Turner and the velvet sermons of men like Senator Cole, whose mansion was surrounded by agents just as he attempted to board a private jet, his face blank as the cuffs locked round his wrists, his mouth silent for once. And yet, despite the arrests, despite the headlines, despite the outrage and the marching and the vigils, Daniel knew something else was coming because power never surrendered without consequence, and monsters built on decades of obedience do not fall quietly in the middle of the third day after the explosion. He received a message from an unknown number, but the tone was familiar. It read, "She's still in the lake. You never looked beneath." Daniel sat with the message for hours, turning it over in his mind, until Margaret said quietly, "Then we go back one last time, not to chase ghosts, but to bring her home." They returned to the lake, not with fear, but with resolve. A team of divers joined them, federal forensic recovery specialists who treated the ground as sacred, every tree, every inch of soil, every ripple of water. A page in a silent book that had waited too long to be read. And then, after 2 hours beneath the surface, a diver broke the water and raised his hand. The others followed carefully, respectfully, carrying a box sealed by time, marked by decay, but inside it bones fabric remnants of a journal page, sealed in plastic, and a bracelet Daniel recognized from the summer of 1997, a simple band with 2 letters etched crudely. MT, Melissa Turner. The media stood back. The officers bowed their heads. Margaret cried, "Daniel, didn't he?" Simply knelt by the box and whispered, "You're not forgotten. You never were." The funeral was held on a hill overlooking the lake, not a church, not a temple. Just open sky and wind and truth. The crowd was larger than expected. Survivors, journalists, prosecutors, families of victims who finally had names to grieve and stories to speak. And when Daniel stood to speak, he said only one thing: "Melissa tried to save us, and we failed her, but we are listening now, and we will not stop." In the weeks that followed, more arrests came, more names, more victims, more stories rising from the places silence had buried them. Daniel gave testimony to a congressional committee, helped launch a national task force, spoke at universities, founded a non-profit in Melissa's name. He did not return to the church. He did not forgive his father, who remained in custody facing multiple federal charges. He did not pretend healing was simple or fast or complete, but he never stopped speaking. He became the voice. Melissa once was the voice for every person who had stood at the edge of silence and feared to scream, and now could. 1 year later, Daniel stood once more at the airport gate, where this all began, where he had given his seat to a quiet, elderly woman with shaking hands and eyes full of memory. He looked out the window at the runway and thought of how a single decision had unraveled everything, how kindness had opened a door to truth, and how the note she gave him, "I know what you did in 1997," had not been an accusation but an invitation to remember, to rise, to face what he had run from for too long. He boarded the flight with a quiet heart, not empty, but full, not burdened, but ready. He sat by the window this time, watching the sky turn gold with morning, and when the flight attendant asked if he needed anything, he said, "Just this seat," and smiled, knowing that the seat he had once given away had been the beginning of a journey, not into darkness, but through it, toward a light that Melissa had always carried, and which now would never go out. The end.